and welcome to our session on mammal tracks and signs. During this session we're going to look at the kind of things that you can look out for that will give you an indication of whether mammals have been present or not. We're going to be looking at predominantly tracks, footprints and droppings and feces that will be left behind by your mammal. The first part of this is about footprints, and it's worth mentioning that it's really only the larger mammals that you're going to find footprints of. You need a considerable amount of weight in order to actually make an indent in the ground. So for our hares and our rabbits, for example, you're only likely to find tracks in softer substrate, so if it has been raining a lot and, say, snow. It's also worth thinking about the effect that the condition of the substrate will have on your footprints. So by which I mean that you can look in books and see perfect footprints given to you, but the animals are often running or walking. There'll be a difference if they're going up or downhill. If it's particularly muddy, they could be slipping in that, and you'll get a skewing from that perfect footprint that you will be observing in the books. So this is just the sort of things to look out for to give you an indication of what animal is actually being present. So we can see from the diagram that we've got here for our rabbit and our hare, they're very, very similar footprints, and what you are going to have to think about is the size. And again, size is brilliant if you've got a comparable element, and the likelihood of you having a rabbit and a hare track next to each other probably quite small. The other thing you can bring into this is thinking about what animals you've commonly got in that area and the habits of that animal as well. So for example, rabbits tend to live communally, hares not so much. So if you've got one set of footprints, it would lean you towards thinking that it would be a hare, and if you've got lots of tracks all over the place, then it's quite likely to be a rabbit. As an example, we've got some snow, and you can see it's interesting the reverse way round of the print. So in this particular situation, the rabbit would be coming towards us, but it's very easy to think that you've got 2 feet, the back feet at the bottom of this photo, and then the 2 feet going forward. But because of the way that the rabbits and the hares move, you get the 2 front feet going in together and the rear feet following. The next one is about foxes, dogs and cats. So cats, firstly, very wide spreading of the toes in almost a straight line. They're also very small. However, a big cat could well be confused with a fox, and dogs of course come in such a wide variety of sizes that you could have any size footprint caused by a dog. Some of the key things to look out for is the pattern of your tracks. So foxes tend to walk in very straight lines. They tend to set their sights on where they're going and head there, whereas dogs, more than cats, tend to be sniffing and absorbing their environment. So you'll get much more erratic patterning of footprints from dogs. The other thing to think about is the pad layout, and something that is very typical of your fox footprint is the fact that you can draw a cross through it without dissecting any of the pads. So you can draw straight lines through the first 2 and the last 2 pads, and those lines should not cross through the main heel pad that you've got at the bottom there. Just as an example, we've got some prints here. What I've tried to do with the first one is I've started to try and get the cross shape straight through the toe pads, but you can see at the bottom that crosses through the pad at the base of the foot. So we would probably assume that what we have got here is not a fox print. And of course, I know it's not a fox print because I know who took the picture. Again, for this one, what I've tried to do this time is draw the cross so that it's clean of the base pad of the foot, but you can again see that those lines then cross through the toe pads at the top. So we've definitely here got a dog print, and this will be the same case if you try that with a cat footprint as well. So that's a really good indication of a fox print. For our next ones, we've got badger and otter. Badger, quite distinctive. You've got all of the toes similar in many respects to the cat, in almost a straight line, but this is even more so than you would get in a cat print. It almost looks as though someone has made a fist and dug their knuckles into the ground of their fingers. You really almost have a straight line with those pads, and then the pad at the base of the foot is much wider and more oblong in shape than you would get for the fox, the dog or the cat. The otter, because of their feet being adapted for water, you often get an inkling of the markings around the outside of the foot where they've got slight webbing and padding in order to help them swim. Now, with the rear foot in particular, you almost get a print that looks a bit like a hand, a tiny little hand. It's almost a little bit creepy because it would only have 4 fingers. But if we look at some examples, and I'll come back to mink in a second. This is in many respects a little bit difficult to see, so I'm going to use the pointer at this point and just show that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 toe pads that we can see here, and then you've got this large pad at the base of the foot. So what we've got here is a badger print. Again, in this situation, slightly harder ground, so we can't actually see the pad at the base of the foot, but you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 prints, and they are almost in that straight line. Just to give you an idea of size, and also this print here, we've got the claws at the front of the foot that have been included as well. So this is much softer ground than the previous 2 photos. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 toe prints, the heel or the base print here, and then you can see where their long claws have also gone into the ground. This is what I'm talking about in terms of the otter. Now, I realise that it's a very faint footprint and it might be quite difficult for you to see, so I've just sort of tried to adjust the photo to give you an idea of what's going on here. So we've highlighted the imprint. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4 finger-like structures that come away from this. So either we've discovered a tiny little alien child, or what we've got here is an otter print. So it's a strong indication of an otter. Again, if you use your knowledge of where you are you in an area where otters have been sighted? Are you near water? All these pieces of information will help you. Now, I said I would go back to mink because mink is the one that you may well get confused with in terms of the otter, because their territories, the habitat they like to use, tends to overlap, and we have got mink in this area. But if you have a look at the mink footprints, firstly, the mink are a lot smaller than an otter, so you wouldn't necessarily get confused unless what you have got is a juvenile otter print. The other thing is the size of that base print, and the mink's feet are slightly less adapted in terms of the water, so they are often associated with living near the water, but the otter has got those true adaptations to their feet in order to swim really, really well. So you wouldn't necessarily get that webbing as obvious. You would just get, as per the others, your prints and then this very typical of our smaller mustelid print. The base print is that sort of more horseshoe shape when we're looking at the mink. Next we have the deer, and this first print that we've got for you to look at here is a fallow deer print. If we think about it in terms of size, the fallow deer footprint, you can see here, is one of the largest that you will find of the deer that we get in this country. The only larger one is going to be the red deer. What you will find is that this first picture is a very typical textbook, if you like, print from a deer. And although you haven't got the full imprint of it, you've got toes equally spaced as you would expect on the foot. So this is a deer that is moving at quite a relaxed pace. What you will find is that the faster the deer moves, or depending on whether they're going uphill or downhill, you may well get some splaying of the toes. So in this second photo, that's what we can see, is there's a slight separation of the toes at the top of this print. These tracks are munked-up tracks, so they are much smaller in size in comparison to the fallow deer. As I've said previously, what you want to use is your knowledge of the area. So if you know what deer species you have got in that area, that will help you in terms of identifying and narrowing down what footprints you're actually looking at. This print here, not mud, we've got snow here. And again, fainter, not too much depth to that snow. And this is a very typical roe deer print. The deer footprints tend to have this almost teardrop shape, two teardrops next to each other. And that's one of the things to look for. What we've got here is a roe deer print, and this is one of the species where what you can find is an imprinting of the dew claws at the back as well. So this deer moving relatively quickly, although the snow's quite soft, so it could just be that, and the toes are splayed at the front, and you can very clearly see the dew claws imprinted in the snow at the back there. Around here, one of the main things is telling the difference between your deer and your sheep. This can be very difficult, and mainly that is because you don't know how long that footprint has been in the ground to when you get it. Different ground conditions will give you different qualities of print, and the longer the print is there, the more it's going to be affected by other elements like weather and other people walking around that site. Again, it's a case of common sense in the most part. If you are in a livestock field full of sheep, then it's likely to be a sheep footprint. Quite often what you find is that teardrop shape is actually less obvious in sheep than it is in deer. But if you are in an area where you don't have deer and they're fenced and kept out of that particular area, then you can usually assume that you are definitely looking at deer rather than just one sheep that's been wandering across a site. The other clues to look for are the other signs that your animal will leave behind. So here we've got what were actually a numerous amount of fallow deer footprints, and probably about 6 of the deer coming through, but these deer were also leaving droppings as they were walking through. So if you piece together those two parts, then you can be even more confident in your identification. This leads us quite nicely into the droppings. So we'll start with deer, and deer droppings tend to be of varying sizes depending on the species that you are dealing with. They are quite often a cylindrical shape with this point or nipple at the top of each individual dropping. Now, they actually come out as tiny little pellets all grouped together as a dropping, and depending on what that deer has been eating depends on how much breakage part of those dropping pellets you'll get. Also, you will find that the shape is more defined if the animal has been eating drier substances than, say, moss. What you can find as well is that there are almost straightish edges, so you'll almost get a sort of cube with an extension at the top with this point on it, and that's just where those little pellets have been together to form that main dropping. If we have a look here, this is quite a good typical example. Again, I'll use the pointer because the one we'll have a focus on is here. So you can see this is almost a flattened side here, a flattened side here. We've got this almost cuboid shape at the base, and then it comes up to the top into a point. This is fallow deer poo, and then we're followed with some roe deer poo. Roe deer poo typically tends to have a slightly looser shape from that typical form that you would expect. If we have a look at the fox droppings, one thing that it's worth noting about fox is that there is often a twist in your fox poo. And quite often you can see the dropping in two separate bits, and there'll be a twist in the middle joining those two sections. Here is an in real life poo, so about 10 centimetres long. You can see, if you have a look at this photo, that we've got quite a dark colour. Fox poo tends to have quite high fur content. That's going to be the main element of what they've been eating that they're going to be trying to get rid of, the undigestible part of that animal. Foxes tend to have quite a strong smell, and the poo is of no exception, and quite often the way that people find they've come across fox poo is because dogs have rolled in it, and then you've got a very stinky dog afterwards. So it's quite a distinctive smell that you will get from fox droppings. Obviously, the older your dropping is, the less pungent that smell is going to be. Some other droppings that you're likely to come across in our area: badger and otter. Quite often in books you will see badger droppings described as this large pellet. I have to be honest, I have never come across any truly well-formed badger droppings. This is quite often what you will find. Now, the more earthworm content to that badger's diet, the more sloppy the droppings. And you can see that there's pretty high content of worms in this particular badgers. You'll also get seasonal differences. Badgers are quite partial to blackberries, so you will quite often find berry seeds and almost a sort of purplish tinge to the droppings in the autumn when the blackberries are around as well. One of the telltale things about badgers is that badgers tend to use latrine sites, and they actually use this for territory marking. So you will quite often find them at edges of areas. So to give you a bit of context with this particular photo, we're at the edge of a ditch, and you can see the wooden structure in the corner is actually a bridge going over the ditch. So we're on one side, and then we've got another field on the other side of that bridge. So because we're at the edge of a section or a territory area, we've got a latrine site on that side. And what that is saying from that set of badgers is, for any other badger that comes into the area, is that they've sort of strayed too far from their area, their territory. They have done quite a few tests on this, and badgers tend to be quite loyal to their set territories, and they've done an experiment of feeding different sets wax pellets that were of different colours. And because they're not digestible, you would then get those coming out in the droppings. And what they're able to do is see, because of the latrine sites, exactly which sets were leaving which boundary indicators, and they were able to plot the boundaries that those territories took up. So it's an interesting use of the behaviour of this animal and the tracks of this animal that they leave behind, or even the droppings. Next one then is otter. So we are next to the water for our otter droppings. What you tend to find is they will like somewhere that is quite secure in terms of disturbance, and they will often use the same location repeated times if it is suitable for them to do so. So what we're actually looking at here is this section that's just poking out into the water. And this area here is quite often used by an otter, and we often find spraints left behind. Here's a delightful picture. We can see several spraints here that were on this particular rock, and not long after, the water levels came up and washed all of these away, and you're left with blank slates again. So you can then get an indication of how soon, if you're monitoring a spot, how soon after those events the otters are coming back, and how frequently they're using a particular site. So if we start at the top left, you can see that this is a dropping that has broken down substantially, and you can see small bones that make up the animals that the otter has been eating. And then the others are much more recent. It's almost kind of oily in appearance, and all of the books say that it's got a faint smell of jasmine tea about it, but you will have to get quite up close and personal in order to find that out. So obviously a personal choice. You may also be able to make out some of the fish scales from what the otter has been eating as well. When we look at the rodents, we are often looking at much smaller droppings, and often we're thinking about the fear of finding those droppings, particularly in our home environment. One thing that's worth mentioning at this point in time is that you would obviously deal with having mice, also bats, in your house very differently. So a very simple indication, if you find droppings of whether you've got a mouse or a bat, is that despite the appearance being very similar, bat poo is very, very dry. So if you rub it between your thumb and forefinger, it will just turn into dust, whereas mouse poo won't do that. If we think about some of the slightly larger rodents, water voles, for example, often found near water, funnily enough, and our rats, which also can be found near water, you can see there's a slight irregularity to the rat dropping shape, whereas the water vole here has a very regular shape. But smell is often your key indicator between the two. Another of the more difficult to find droppings is squirrel. Squirrels tend to have lives that take place up in the trees. They're primarily arboreal. If they are down in the ground scavenging, then they're often in quite dense vegetation underneath them, or lots of leaves, and this makes the fact that they will leave very small droppings behind very difficult to actually see. Rabbit and hare. Rabbit is probably the dropping that everybody's most familiar with. And hare is very, very similar, but larger. And it does say in the description here that it's often more flattened as well. It is variable, and also, as I've said a number of times now, size is not particularly helpful when we're looking at identification, because unless you've got the smaller version or the larger version there to compare against, you know, it's all relative and not necessarily helpful. So again, think about where you are, whether you've got rabbits and or hares there. Maybe if you've got both in an area, you can find both and you can compare. With our carnivores, they're very, very twisty in shape, and they're not necessarily that easy to distinguish between each other. Again, think about where you are, what species you've got present. Stoats and weasels are very different in size, so their droppings will obviously mirror that as well. You've got some extra clues in the table which give you an idea about the difference in smell, but again, that is purely dependent on how fresh that particular dropping is, and whether you feel comfortable going around sniffing poo you found lying around. Polecat and mink, again, also very, very twisty and similar to the others. Worth noting though, because quite often mink and otter are the ones that everybody wants to tell the difference between, that the mink poo is very different to that of the otter poo. So if you are near that river environment and you're not sure, then if you can find droppings as well as footprints, that will help you to identify what you've actually got in that stretch of river. Some of the other things that we might find are other signs that animals have been around. So we've got a bird that was predated on. You're never sure whether it is another bird that has taken that bird down, or if, say, a fox has caught that bird. And one of the indications that it's a fox, in this case, if we have a look at the end of the feather here, you can see that that has been chewed off, and that is very typical of your fox. A bird will pluck those feathers out. Some paths. Quite often our animals are very loyal to certain tracks to and from where they live, and this is a track that is made by badgers, so they repeatedly use the same path as they leave their set and go off to find food in the evening, and they leave a very distinctive trail behind. Foxes often do the same. If we think about where the animals live, is you can get some reasonable indicators from finding holes in the ground. So this is a sizable hole. If you have a look at the shape, it's quite an oval shape here, and also it's worth having a look as quietly as you can, so you don't disturb the animal, around the outside. So there is often a lot of debris of dry grass that the badger has brought into the set. In the case of badgers, you may find footprints around the entrance to the hole, and you may also find hair, and badger hair is very distinctive. It's got 3 separate tones in it, and if you roll it in your fingers, you can feel that the actual hair itself has got edges. This hole here, again, is made from a badger, and it's part of a badger set. This is a much larger hole. I would imagine that that is probably because of the tree roots that you can see that the badger has excavated around those in order to get an area big enough for them to fit in through those tree roots. This area here is actually a foxhole. So foxes don't tend to dig their own holes or build their own areas in which to use. What they will do, however, is repurpose abandoned badger sets or rabbit holes and just make those rabbit holes a bit bigger. And in this case, you've got a hollow tree and it's found a way into that, so they will shelter in there. This is another example for a fox, and you can see we've got a hole that was actually originally part of rabbits digging into this bank, but we've got fresh excavation and the fox has gone in and they have made a much larger entrance to that, and they'll take shelter in there, particularly when they are breeding, when they have got small cubs, because having these shelters just under the ground for their small cubs keeps their cubs much more protected. I have had an instance when I have been walking the dog and I've looked into a rabbit hole while I've been waiting for my dog to return. And there was a very tiny little fox cub face staring up at me. I am forever grateful that I managed to see that before my dog managed to get all the way to me, because I was then able to move away from that, put my dog in a lead and move past before my dog discovered the same thing as I had. But it's always worth keeping your eye open with things like this, because you will get those sightings if you're standing quietly somewhere for a little while and just looking. What we're going to do for our next section is I have got some poo samples and we're going to have a little go at testing your knowledge. So what will follow is some video footage of some samples of poo, and we'll let you have a think about what they are. And after that video footage, we'll come back to the presentation slides and we'll let you know what those answers are. Hi and welcome to Poo-vestigation. Our first sample for you to identify we have here. You can see that we have got a sample that is set in resin, but the poo droppings themselves are round in shape, spherical in shape, quite a dark colour. We've got several together here, and this is typically how you would actually find them. And sample number 2, very similar shape, very similar colouring to the previous sample, but you can see that we've only got one set within this sample here. Smaller than the previous sample, and we'll probably say that it's even more spherical in shape. So this is sample number 3. We've got more of an elongated shape to this dropping, still quite dark in colour, so dark brown, but more of a sausage shape. The size is more similar to the previous sample than the sample before that, so it's more similar in size to sample 2 than sample 1. And here we have sample 4. Again, a sausage-shaped dropping. It's smaller than the previous sample, and I would say it's skinnier in terms of proportions. So we've actually got 2 together in this sample here. Again, very similar colour. We have several droppings in this sample, and they would typically form a pellet. If we have a look at the shape, they're reasonably rounded. Some of them are more elongated than spherical, and you can see at the top, particularly on this one here, there is a little point at the top of that dropping there. You can see we've got a few others where the point is much more visible. Reasonably small individual droppings as well. If we move on to sample 6, you can see that we've got a very similar shape to the last sample. I would say even less rounded again, so more elongated, almost square sides to each of the droppings that make up this pellet. Again, we've got the point on the end of that dropping. Our next one, so this is sample number 7, we haven't got set in resin. So we'll just move those closer so you can have a look at those. You can see we've got a rounded shape and definite point on the end. Those squarish sides are not as prominent, and of all 3 samples, this is actually the largest of the ones that are quite similar. This is sample 8. If we try and angle it so that you can get as much of a view as possible. So this is sausage shaped again, but bigger than the previous droppings that we've had of a similar shape. If it wasn't set in resin, something that would give you a clue would be quite a shiny appearance to the surface of these droppings. And you can see that they're made up of lots of small debris almost, rather than bones and fur. So for dropping number 9, I've got another one that is not set in resin. It is very twisted in shape. It's quite a greyish colour. Part of that is due to drying, so originally it was much darker, but still a sort of blackish greyish colour, very, very twisted. And the reason why this has dried out and not gone mouldy is because predominantly it's made up of fur, so very high fur content within this particular dropping. So dropping number 10, another one that isn't set in resin. It's not particularly easy to see on this dropping, but it has got a twisting to its shape, but it has broken apart as well. You can see that this particular dropping has got a hair content, but it's also got a shiny appearance as well. Quite dark in colour and quite delicate, so it's breaking apart quite easily. So this is sample 11, and we have got again some smallish sausage shaped dropping, and I'm just going to do something that will help and give us a clue. So squish this between my fingers and it has turned to dust. So this is our 12th and final sample, and it's quite wet. That could be for 2 reasons. It could be that this particular animal has had quite a moisture-filled diet, or it could actually just be the weather conditions at the particular time that this sample was collected. You can see that there's a twisting in the shape. We've got 3 sections that would originally have been joined together. And in this section here, we've got some fronds coming from it, and you'd be excused for thinking that that is, say, grass or bone. It actually is filaments from a feather, but we can also see there's some hair in this dropping sample as well. Welcome back. I hope that you enjoyed having a look at the different poo samples, and also that you were able to pause them and take as much time as you needed to try and get your answers together. So these are the answers that we have. The first sample that we looked at was rabbit. So we had 4 droppings in that particular sample set in resin, and rounded shape, predominantly vegetation within that. And quite a typical one that you would find. I think most people are familiar with a rabbit dropping. The second one is one that is very hard to find, and I feel quite lucky to have actually managed to collect one of these samples. So this is a squirrel. It's very similar in appearance to a rabbit, but you don't tend to get many droppings together, whereas the rabbit you tend to find quite a large volume of droppings in that location. Rat dropping, elongated in shape, very similar shape to what you would expect from a mouse or a vole, but much, much larger. Mouse or a vole is very typical what we get, and I've got to be honest, I am not in a position to be able to tell the difference between the two. It is possible, but it is quite challenging. So this is mouse or vole poo. Number 5 is muntjac. So our smallest deer that we get in this country. Not likely to find it around this area in the Dales, but it does demonstrate reasonably well the difference between the dropping size from, say, the smallest deer to the largest deer. Number 2 is fallow. The fallow deer droppings tend to follow the pattern that you would expect, or the shape that you would expect for the deer, as closely of all of them. So those squared off sides with the point at the top, very typical of what you would expect for the fallow deer. Number 7 was the roe deer, and many would expect, because of the size difference between the animals, that roe deer poo would in fact be smaller than fallow deer poo. What you would tend to get, however, is large droppings or large pellets from the fallow deer made up of those separate droppings, whereas the roe deer, you would tend to get the droppings coming out in reasonable succession of each other and finding more of a trail of those droppings rather than a large pellet that then separates. We've got hedgehog as our next one, as sample number 8. So the shiny appearance that is mentioned in the video, not particularly helpful when you've set it in resin, is because of the beetle cases. So if you've got hedgehog that is at that point in time feeding quite a lot on beetles, then you will get that very shiny appearance to the dropping. Stoat, that group of animals tend to have very, very similar droppings, and you can see that the picture we've got on this slide is that stoat poo. So very, very twisted in appearance and very high fur content. Related to that is the otter. It tends to be, because of the difference in diet, a little more difficult to see the twisting in the otter poo. One thing that will probably give you a reasonable indication that is otter rather than any of the others is the contents and the location. So the shiny appearance to the otter poo is actually from the fish scales themselves. You'll quite often find fish bones within the dropping, and you will often find those near the water. 11 is our bat, very similar in shape to a mouse or a vole poo, although tends to be slightly more twisted in appearance, and it's the crumbling that gives us the clue as to the difference. So because you've got such a high insect content in bat poo and very little moisture within that, you get a very crumbly poo that disintegrates when you squeeze it between your fingers. And the last one is fox poo, a very wet fox poo because of the current weather conditions from when this poo was collected. You often find that the poo will quite readily break into the separate sections. If you're lucky enough to find it all strung out together, then you'll get that twist, that very thin twist between each of the sections of the dropping. Very, very strong odour with this one, particularly because it was quite fresh when it was collected. I hope that you had an interesting time doing that you managed to get a reasonable number correct, and thank you for joining us for our Tracks and Signs PowerPoint. Please have a look at, if you haven't already, the PowerPoints on mammals as a general overview within the Dales, and also have a look at the owl pellet analysis video too.